welcome to our podcast. Today we're going to be talking about AI and data analytics. I'm Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. I'm joined today by Mark Enzer and Dale Sinclair. But before I go to introductions, just really want to set a scene, if you like, for today's podcast. So at the Major Projects Association, we rarely repeat topics within sort of a 2 to 3 year sort of window or time frame. But the topic of AI, I've sort of gone back over our fringe events and our seminars and so on, and we seem to be revisiting it sort of 2 to 3 times a year. And the reason for that is that it's such a fast moving aspect of our work and our life generally, not least sort of how we then can apply that to major projects. And to give you an example of that pace, and it was the feature of a seminar that we did back in June 2024. We sort of highlighted that sort of Netflix took 3.5 years to get its first million subscribers, and when ChatGPT was launched by OpenAI, it took just 5 days. Likewise, 2 months later, it hit 100 million users, which is unprecedented in terms of subscriber volumes, in terms of that pace. It was launched in December 2022, and at the time it had a whole load of information it was trained on, I think, up till 2020. And since then, we're seeing sort of new releases of it as the training base gets increased. It now has access to the internet. And in the last release, ChatGPT 4 Omni, as it was called, is now multimodal, if I've got that the right expression. But we can interact with it with pictures, with video, and with audio, so we can talk to it now rather than having to interact with it through a keyboard. And it opens up all sorts of different possibilities. And we couldn't imagine that back in December 2022. And that's just one platform that we're thinking about. So we firmly put that pace in the crosshairs of a discussion back in June 2025. And I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Enzer and Dale Sinclair today, who Mark chaired the event and Dale was one of our speakers and panelists. And welcome, Mark. Welcome, Dale. Can you just do a quick, brief introduction? Say who you are, Mark first, and then Dale.
Thanks very much, Andy. I'm Mark Enzer. I'm a strategic advisor at Mott MacDonald.
Yeah. Hi, Andy, and thanks for the invite. I'm Dale Sinclair. I'm a fellow at WSP and head of digital innovation within WSP.
Great. And Mark, you're sort of downplaying a little bit there in terms of your role previously with the Centre for Digital Built Britain and your campaign around sort of digital twins and so on. So we're in good company today in terms of this topic of AI and the pace of change with it. I'd like to start at the beginning of when we were discussing it in the seminar. And Mark, one of the things you said was AI is out there already. This is not some kind of super-duper future thing that we're waiting for. It's with us. And I've always felt there's a danger when we talk about AI that we start thinking of future and future thinking, and we end up sort of having hypothetical discussions. And that hypothetical angle means that there's already a barrier to adoption and how we use it now, because people are thinking about things that might be coming along in, say, 3, 5, 6 months or a year or more. And Dal, you sort of echoed that as well. You in one of your sessions, you talked about the difference between the sort of the experimenters and the sort of pathfinders that just want to try and find and sort of apply new things, and then the fearful laggards. And there's a big gap between those two communities. And you said the only way to bridge that gap is to keep showing real use cases of where things are actually happening. So I thought I would start right off at the beginning then to say, let's talk about things that really are happening, and give some good examples of how AI and data analytics being used in major projects. So which of you would like to go first on that one?
No, I'll chip in. I'll just go for it. So I think you did a great introduction there, Andy, and it kind of pointed to a load of the things which people are kind of becoming more and more familiar with, and ChatGPT. And so the example that I would like to give actually is not about generative AI, because I think in some ways that's had too much airtime, and we know it and love it. So the example I'd like to give is about computer vision, which is kind of another aspect of AI, and the idea of using computer vision to help identify people and plant moving on a site to help create a safer working environment. So that's quite a long way away from kind of predicting the next word or the next pixel, but it's still AI. And I guess this is one of the things I'd like to get across is that AI is not just one thing, it's many things. So that would be my opening example.
Yes, and I think these are great points, and I would agree with Mark. I think there's been too much noise created by Chat GPT, but in a sense, I think it's served the benefit of alerting people to the fact that AI is out there and it's only going to get more and more profound. Uh, and similar to Mark, I think the examples I would give are quite pragmatic, but I guess I want to start the conversation by just saying, look, before generative AI, there was lots of things happening. AI is not new; it's been around for decades. But the sort of things we're doing, for example, we've created a tool called Daisy that's just been winning some awards recently, where we use generative AI backed into some LLM models to do allow us to analyze different parameters for a building, the height, daylighting, energy use, and so on. So we are seeing these tools develop. And a lot of our structural analysis tools or simulation tools are also using AI. So we are seeing that simulation side of things using AI. And a lot of the architects that we work with also are using generative design tools to look at hundreds of different options, or if not millions of options, in a fraction of a second around a kind of set of parameters. So, and I'm sure we'll come on to this. To me, these are just the nuggets of how we begin to move forward, and they're all very individual use cases. And I think the future is not really going to be around individual use cases, but let's not steal the thunder of the later conversation.
Yeah, and it's I guess you're right in one aspect, in that the Chat GPT and generative AI has stolen the limelight, and I suspect that's because we can try it at home. We can sort of put, we can get it on the browser. We can put requests in. We can see how it's applied and so on, and sort of we can sort of be thrilled by the magic of what of what sort of appears to come from it. But it may well be in our projects world, it's the other aspects of that pattern recognition, that computer vision, as you said, Dale, and the sort of the pattern recognition in lessons and designs that you're seeing, Dale, as well. So it's fascinating. I was taken back by one of the examples that we had in the seminar itself, which was about the M25 and considering the project work that needs to be done. And it's a perennial battle for people who work in infrastructure, where you're doing enhancements or upgrades of getting possession. So we know that the longer possession you have, the more work you can do. The overhead of setting up for work is smaller the longer the possession and so on. But then it's a trade-off in terms of the impacts that come from it. And the example we had was using sort of traffic modeling using Google Maps over a period of time to see what the least impact would be in terms of time of day and windows of taking that possession compared to traditional ways of working it. And the effect of that was a 12% reduction in the project timeline. That's massive. I mean, and if you apply that across many thousands of projects of that type that are part of major projects, that's a real impact. If we've got that 12% shaving on all sort of timelines because we've got a better possession strategy, that's just things we were unable to do a few years ago. I can see some nods.
Maybe to add a few other examples, just to kind of indicate the variety of use cases, because I think already we've talked about quite a lot of variety. But just picking up on what you were saying, Andy, about the ability to spot patterns. So we can see that being used, for example, in analyzing schedule data to spot patterns of decline where maybe people wouldn't have seen it. Other pattern spotting, which I think is really amazing, but in a completely different space, would be, for example, analyzing photographs of concrete that most people wouldn't want to do, but you can quite easily use AI to do it and kind of and spot where there are issues and degradation. That's really helpful. Also, something which I think is fantastically interesting is the use of AI-based models. where previously in our design we might have had to use physics-based models or agent-based models. Because AI can be so good at matching input and output, you can use some of those original physics-based models as training data for AI-based models, which end up being much lighter and much quicker. And so I think maybe one of the things which we're all saying here is that AI comes in many different shapes and sizes for many different use cases. And so we definitely shouldn't just think it's one thing.
Yeah, and leading on from that, so there is a danger of just trying to apply it, for the sake of applying it. And one of the things that you covered in your talk about the opportunities for AI is the need to be purposeful. And you gave two examples, one about sort of tackling some of the sort of the stubborn issues that hold projects back. And in particular, you gave the example of how productivity has flatlined over the last 30 or so years, even though we seem to be spending lots of money and investment into improving productivity. And the other one is around sort of decarbonising our major projects. And we know from a lot of the work that the association has been doing with our sustainability ambassadors, we really do see that the scale of the change we need to make for 2050 net zero in particular, we can't do that incrementally. So we do need major projects to help us with that challenge. But on the flip side of that coin, our major projects are, traditionally very steel and concrete intensive. So they're part of the problem, even though we might need to use them as a part of the solution. But you sort of tackle those two aspects of being purposeful about the issues and being purposeful about the opportunities. And you use this metaphor, which I was, I loved, but I would just like to hear it again because it was so brilliant. And I was trying to scribble it down at the time about the three little pigs story and our need to tell it backwards, particularly with that decarbonisation one. So for the benefit of those who didn't attend, perhaps give you a chance to retell your three little pig story again.
Yeah, well, let me tell that one first, actually, and then I'll come back to the purposefulness. So yes, every 5-year-old child in the world understands the three pig story, and of course in any language as well. It's not just any child; it's any language. And we go from the straw house to the timber house to the brick house, and I think for me that the challenge with decarbonisation is we're now having to move backwards in terms of the three pigs, because we're trying to move from the brick house back to the timber house and potentially back to the straw house. So what I mentioned in the call was that the day that every 5-year-old child in the world can tell that story backwards is the day that we know we've cracked decarbonisation. And the reason that's relevant, Andy, is that we're seeing the design process becoming much more complex. I think for the last decade, I would say we've been really focused on operational carbon, which is fantastic. But we're now looking at circular economy approaches and taking the embodied carbon out of our buildings. And that's actually making the process of designing buildings more complex because we have more systems. We've got systems that were not used. And I think this is the introduction of AI is a real opportunity to move away from what we traditionally do. So our conversation today is focused on these fantastic use cases, but I think it's the things that we could do with AI that become really relevant. So, for example, on every project, we make thousands of decisions heuristically. We have 6 people in a room, they decide something, it's not very well recorded, and then we move on. And we are finding a shift to program approaches. And of course, on a program approach, it becomes really important to understand not just what the decision was and who made it, but it was why that decision was made. Because otherwise, on the second project, using this new way of working, everyone says, "Well, why did I see the decision here, but I don't understand why this team made that decision." So I think for me, the future really needs to be looking at how we can use AI to remove some of this new complexity, as I would call it, and actually make things simple again, trying to take some of the heavy lifting out of projects so that we can tackle the carbon challenge. Because if we're adding to the process, that obviously that just makes things more efficient, and we're changing the design process. We're trying to make more things in the factory. So I see AI as being really essential to trying to solve some of these challenges. But I think we need to frame the challenges first before we start to look at the solutions. So that's why I just try to open people's eyes to the scale of the challenge by talking about three pigs backwards.
Yeah, and it also means that there's a massive prize, isn't there, in terms of what can be achieved if we, apply the new capabilities that we have to the challenges that we've struggled to address. You talk about those heuristics, and I'd like to sort of build upon that, because the interaction between those six people in a room and then coming to a decision, it is part of the data that exists. It's a part of the record of the project that led to an outcome. But when we think about project data, often we're focused on time and cost data, things that sit in schedules or in the spreadsheets that we use. And I was interested in that when we talked about the pace and dealing with the pace, Mark, you were trying to bring us back to let's not rush too far ahead. We've got to get some foundations in place, and part of that foundation is data, and the other foundation you highlighted is the skills side of things. So I'd like you to sort of come in on that if you can, and perhaps draw on your experience for your previous role at the Centre for Digital Built Britain in terms of project data and what we can do to improve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this thing of kind of addressing what Dale was talking about, and you were saying that there is actually a desire to rush ahead, and I wish that we could rush ahead. We do need to be making progress and addressing those things that Dale said. The thing is, though, that it has to be on firm foundations, and I think that we have this kind of weird dichotomy with AI, because it offers us some really exciting possibilities, and some very exciting and shiny things. The trouble is that we've got to get the foundations right, and that there's some really boring, hard work kind of stuff that needs to be done in order to do that rushing ahead and to get those shiny things to actually work. And I guess people don't like talking about the boring stuff, do they? However, it's absolutely essential. And I think for me, two which keep coming up in this space, and actually, as you've indicated, they kept coming up back in the days of the Centre for Digital Built Britain as well, are these issues to do with data and skills. It seems to be that those are persistent issues that we absolutely have to address. And it feels to me that maybe civil engineers should understand the kind of the metaphor of foundations. That they're largely unseen but essential. If we don't get the foundations right, then the rest literally doesn't work. So we got to sort out data and skills, and particularly in the data space, we've got to attend to data quality, data availability, the interoperability to get data on the move. All of these things we've really got to sort out. And then when it comes to skills, I guess it's a kind of a perennial issue, isn't it? That whenever anything new comes up in our space, we got to have the skills, but the skills kind of have to be ahead of the need rather than just always being reactive. And so we got to see the kind of the opportunities and recognize where these increased skills and capabilities need to be. And it's pretty much through the whole segment of our industry. It's not just the new people coming in that need these new skills. It's the people who are already in. And so we got to kind of revisit how do we do a bit of retraining and upskilling for lots of people who are already in the industry.
I couldn't agree more than that, Andy. And I think for me, just layering in on that I think we're still seeing some what I would call optimized traditional elements impeding that shift to a paradigm change in what we do. For example, we still issue thousands of scaled drawings in a project, and what we should be able to do is just 2D views on the fly and really focus on the metadata in the models that we create, and then allow other software to begin to leverage and lean in on that data. And the 2 points I think I would add to what Mark has said around interoperability and so on is just that focus on metadata and classification. We still see a lot of models that are really poorly classified. So I couldn't agree more with what Mark's saying, that it is very kind of dull, and there's a bit of drudgery involved, but we do need to try and focus on the foundations, because it's easy to get ahead of ourselves and look at this amazing future using AI, but we've got to get that solid starting point in place.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, a bit of my background is that I've spent a fair bit of time, developing methodology. I was involved with the development of Prince 2, for example, and I was going back over, what we have in the, the spectrum of guidance and methods around the use of data. And if you did a quick, Google now and had a look at them all, there's a lot of things around things like configuration management. There'll be, content in there around documentation and registers and so on. But it's not really about what data do we need for what decisions. And then when you start thinking of it that way, where does the data come from? How do you know its quality? What's the method of analyzing it? How do you present it in a way that the receivers can make best use of it? And then we got to the critical things about then what happens when the project finishes. Where does it go? How do we keep it safe? How do we exploit it? And we never really, I think the world of project management, rather than perhaps engineering, has never really thought about data in that way. We think about documentation, configuration management, lessons learned reports, rather than about data. And I think that's a shift we need to make. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think what's interesting, the term that I hear quite often now is all about actionable insights, really. And in some senses, that's really before. I mean, it's another point about how we transition from traditional ways of doing what we do towards AI. But I think it's just looking at, well, what's the data that would give us the insights? Because we're doing that a lot just with traditional data management processes just now. And again, those are the stepping stones towards AI solutions. But I do see a lot of data generated and a lot of dashboards, and I'm thinking, well, what? It's not actually telling me anything. I can't. This dashboard looks fantastic, but there is not a single thing that I can do with that. So I think it's, for me, there's all these complex conversations we need to have. What are the things that we've been doing for hundreds of years that we really do? Please, can we just stop doing them? What are the things that would allow us to get those actionable insights? And those are all those stepping stones towards then having the AI solutions start to connect all these different silos of use cases that we've been speaking about.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think Dale's exactly right to be talking about these actionable insights. And for me, the key thing in there is about making better decisions faster, because if we sort out these foundations of data and skills, and we kind of got AI working for us, we still need to kind of work out. So what's the point of doing that? Why are we doing it? It's not just because it's fun or because we can. There's a reason, and the reason is because it helps us to make better decisions faster, and that's what leads to the better outcomes. And so I completely agree with Dale, and it seems like we're doing a lot of agreeing here, but I hope that's okay. Because the thing is, we don't just want the data, we want to generate insight from that. And the point of generating the insight is in order to make better decisions, because the decisions lead to actions, and the actions lead to the better outcomes. So I think that really that's the kind of the essence of all of this. It's where the value gets released. It's where we increase our productivity, is basically if we're making those better decisions.
Just building on that, Mark, is we've spoken before about heuristic processes. So it's not just about making better decisions, it's about making consistent decisions. I'm sure if we took one decision that's made on projects across the UK, we'd probably find that 100 teams had 98 versions of that decision. So it's also trying to make sure that we identify what are the decisions that we make, and then look at how we can get get these more consistent. Because if you ask most people how many decisions that they made, say yesterday, people probably go, I don't think I made any decisions yesterday. And then if you try and unpack that, so, well, what did you do yesterday? And they say, well, I did this and this. Well, that sounds like a decision to me. So the whole point about heuristic processes is we don't even realize how many decisions that we actually make in a day. So imagine if we could actually understand that, and then back to your point, Mark, we would the decisions that we would make would be so much better than we currently do.
Yeah, and the other thing, Andy, that was in your question that I thought it'd be good to just explore a bit, is this thing about how important what we're talking about is in the project management space and in major project delivery, and it absolutely is. But that's not the only domain in which it's important. It's also important in the ongoing operation, maintenance, and use of the stuff that we have delivered. And I think one of the things which our whole industry has not been quite so good on is that interface, between projects and systems. At that point when we stop doing the activities and it starts being an asset. And really, we need to, as a whole industry, get better at that kind of flow of data, relevant data, through from the project stage into the ongoing operation, maintenance, and use. And I think that there's a big area of improvement that we can be doing specifically at that interface.
Yeah, it's really interesting to say that. My last client side role, one of the things I looked at was the contractual obligations for sort of as built, information, the sort of contract closeout, because we were spending huge amounts of money on things like site surveys and investigations on, at the start of projects, when we should have all that information from the collective as built information at the completion. And there was a real challenge in terms of getting that good quality, information handed over into that operational environment and then maintained. So we always end up spending that money, doing the investigations to start projects when we ought to have it in the first place. And it's almost like, well, if we're not going to do it properly, then why do we pay for it at either end? We could just do it once each time, rather than fooling ourselves that we're doing it twice each time. But I also wonder whether there's an improvement around transparency and accountability that we're likely to see from improved data on projects. And I often think about the analogy of black boxes as flight recorders. And I think it's well documented that there was an improvement in pilot training and pilot accountability, and the investigations that come from whether it's a near miss or unfortunately an accident, going back over what was the behaviour or the decision making that may have led to that, the classic human error. But the recording, including the audio, gives us the opportunity to do that in a non-threatening way. Perhaps that's for another discussion.
Yeah, I would love to be in on that discussion, because I think there's a lot to unpack there, particularly around the accountability around decision making. And both Dale and I have kind of focused in on how important that is. And, the making better decisions faster, and Dale said consistent decisions. So it's a really, we collectively need to be held to account for the decisions we made. And I think that if we're using AI and other tools at our disposal to make better decisions faster, then we kind of need to see the result of those decisions and seeing if we're actually making decisions well, and whether or not, having made the decisions well based on the available information, how do they then turn out? Because then we can learn from it. So there's a lot to unpack in that exact space.
Yeah. We also had an example from Huda Assad from Accenture at the beginning of our seminar around the challenge of bias, and how we do need to understand that as we move, to use AI more on our projects. So I've got a follow-up session with Huda later, so we won't cover that here. But before people are sort of shouting at their phones or wherever they're listening to this podcast that we're not tackling some of the negative, the downsides, or the fearful aspects, we will cover that in another session. But interestingly, it sort of seems to be mirroring or reflecting human bias in a pretty good way in terms of the looking at those different biases. I'd like to come back to the discussion we had around the pace of change. I mean, that was the title of the seminar, and it is a challenge to keep up to date with these things. So, in terms of your top tips, if you like, or your guidance to members, how can people listening to this podcast keep themselves up to speed with what's going on in the world of AI, data analytics, and in particularly how that's being applied to major projects?
So can I jump in on that one with a little bit of a cheeky answer, because it feels very very circular and self-referential, which is to say we can use AI to keep up with AI, amazingly, because a lot of the large language models that we've been talking about are kept up to date with very fresh training data. So what that means is that you can be asking your favorite LLM, whichever one you happen to use, what is the latest? What's happening? Tell me the most up-to-date stuff that I need to know, and it can summarize it for you in a very accessible kind of way. And if it isn't accessible enough, you can go back to it and say, "Can you make this more understandable? Explain it to me as if I'm a primary school child," and it will do that. It's amazing. So my top tip for this, and by the way, I do use this top tip myself. It's where I learn most of my stuff now. Is just ask AI to tell you what the latest stuff is. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, Andy, and it's something we've not spoken about, I do like to flip everything on its head. For me, it's not just about the artificial intelligence. We need to remember it needs to be balanced with human intelligence, and we still don't know really how the human brain works, actually, never mind artificial intelligence, and how our subconscious works when we are actually making decisions as well. And on LinkedIn last year, I think I published a list of books which really try to look at that counterbalance to AI and like where does a human come into this? Because I mean, to make these better decisions, we will still need to step in as humans. We still need our intuition to come to bear at times. So I think the reasonable skill and care of the professional is not going away anytime soon. We still are responsible ultimately for the decisions that get made. It's just that we're trying to use artificial intelligence to make those decisions, as Mark has said, faster and better. So I think let's just remind ourselves that it's not just about focusing on AI, it's all these other topics. So we're looking at anthropology, we're looking at psychology, and all of these other kind of subjects. I mean, it's amazing that some of these science-based topics come out of the woodwork when you start to look at a new future around human and artificial intelligence being balanced. And I think my other point is just look at what you currently do and think, well, is this actually machine readable? Like documents, drawings. I mean, yes, those potentially are machine readable, but not necessarily ideal. So try to just think, how can I make the information that I have more transparent? Meeting minutes, all these things. Well, what would the future look like in a way that we can make all of that information flow much faster and allow AI to actually get to the data that really allows it to make these much better decisions.
Yeah, it's great. That's sort of bringing it back to sort of the human in the loop, or the human aspect, I think is really fascinating. And I've seen some good case studies of where people are just using a large language model as a form of journal, and that's making them more reflective and taking opportunities to express how they're feeling or what's happened, and just getting someone without sort of vested interest, if you like, or something rather, not someone, something without vested interest to play back what they're thinking. Interesting. There's a great case study too of a large language model that looked at sort of analysed many thousands of hours of audio recordings of clinician and patient interaction when they're giving either a prognosis or a diagnosis, and they picked up on moments of poor or good empathy, and they use it to train clinicians to be more empathetic with their patients. So here is AI teaching doctors their bedside manner, making them more human, which is the irony of that is probably not past too many people. So, lastly, just want to look ahead a little bit in terms of our annual conference coming up in October. So we're featuring AI for our annual conference this year. We're going to look at it from sort of three different topics or different angles. So we're looking at what's the sweet spot for major projects. I think we've been covering some of those in this conversation around that sort of pattern recognition and so on. What are the sort of governance and ethical considerations that we need to deal with, recognise and address, and also the potential impact on members. And I guess that particularly impacts some of our knowledge-based members as well, where it's really sort of giving us sort of superpowers in terms of the access to insight and knowledge that we have. As Mark, you just gave that example, tell me the latest on X, or can you give me a comparison between logistics and manufacturing on Y? And those are starting to be really useful. So what are your thoughts on any of those three aspects, either highlighting a sweet spot, perhaps just giving a highlight of a governance or ethical aspect or impact on members? So just a chance to sort of give a bit of a teaser, if you like, of some of the things we might need to address when we put on our conference in October.
I'm happy to cover that first, Andy. So, I mean, I think a lot of the ethical issues are incredibly important, of course, but hopefully there's enough things out there that's maybe not something that should be the topic of a conference. And I think that the impact on members, like we've already said, is maybe about just socializing some of the use cases and so on. For me, the sweet spot is really trying to look at the art of the possible. And, the risk of sounding like a broken record. I think in the MPAA arena, the sweet spot is decision making. How can AI make better decisions? What do we actually mean by that? And just unpacking, actually, how do we currently make decisions which are no different than we would have done several hundred years ago. So how do we shift away from that heuristically driven process into an AI driven one? For me, without a doubt, that's where the focus should be.
Great. Thank you, Daz. Same question to you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the annual conference sounds really good. I mean, I think those areas that you've chosen to look at feel very relevant indeed. The thing which I wonder, which might be kind of like an overall point, it might be something that joins it all up, is how we as an industry end up moving forwards together on this. Because I guess what I observe is that, as so often happens, there are a number of leaders in this space who are charging ahead and doing amazing stuff. But it's not the same as all the boats rising. And there is a danger here that with this context of AI that we've talked about, that the leaders will lead more and that the followers will get left further behind. And I'm not sure that would be good for our industry. So I think that there's an overall point to be addressed here, which is what do we do as an industry, not just what do we do as individual organizations within the industry. And I feel that there's something that is more shared about moving the whole industry forward. And I think it would be great if that kind of meta point came out of the conference as well.
That's a great point. I think, Mark, is around the way that we currently silo what we do. And certainly AI will change that. So the example I would give is we could maybe use AI to write a better brief, so the client can write a better brief. And then obviously I've already set out how the design team are using AI for engineering and architectural aspects. But actually we're starting to look at projects where we're using AI to integrate the kind of brief and the design solution. So I completely agree, Mark. It's starting to use AI to break down the silos, because if we think about the future around the traditional way that we do things in the traditional silos, we will, without a doubt, be optimizing traditional ways of doing things rather than reaching out for the paradigm shift.
Yeah, that's really good points, and it sort of I came across an example recently. We obviously speech to text is something we're all very familiar with. We can see it on TV broadcasts and so on, and it's getting much much better. The days where it would come up with some gobbledygook is sort of rarer than it used to be. But the case I've seen recently is not just speech to text, but speech to multiple languages. So it's getting real time translation, and that's just brilliant. And if we could do the same sort of real-time translation between sponsor, client, contractor, supply chain, different disciplines. So we're sort of talking a common language, even though we've got our own version of our language that perhaps sometimes causes some of those barriers. I think that would be a great addition to our sector. Sadly, we're out of time. I did tell you before we recorded this would fly past, and that's exactly what's happened. So thank you very much, Dale. Thank you very much, Mark, both for your time today and also the contribution you made to our seminar back in June. This is the first of actually 3 podcasts we're going to do ahead of the conference. So the second one we will have with Huda Assad and Dale Fung, also contributors to the seminar in June, and we'll be covering some of those other aspects around the ethical governance and the sort of the understanding aspect. And then I'll be doing my 2nd anniversary podcast with Lawrence Rowland, who's one of those experimenters that you mentioned, Dale, who's been doing a blog per week on using large language models in a project context. So he just does things and sort of shows how it's working. And we did a review on the anniversary of ChatGPT's launch to see how it moved, and he said it had been sort of moved from something that was interesting to sort of like having an enthusiastic grad always on and available to you. So it'd be interesting to see how he's seen it's progressed another year on from when it was launched back in 2022. So please do look out for those. If this is your first podcast from the MPA that you've listened to, please do hit subscribe, and so you'll get alerts on future ones, and look forward to seeing you or having you listen to one of our sessions again soon. Thank you very much.